The last major holdout on LGBT is the Muslim world. And the powers that be in the West are asking one question: how do we get Muslims to accept homosexuality and the gay and trans lifestyle? The answer to this question is clear for them because they have used a strategy to get America and Europe to accept LGBT. Two gay media strategists, Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen, developed a 6-point plan for what they called overhauling straight America. This strategy they published in 1987 and was later developed into a larger book called After the Ball. The purpose of this strategy was to mainstream LGBT. And the strategy was so successful that within 20 years, they were able to turn a deeply conservative Christian country, the United States, into a country that celebrates openly every aspect of the LGBT ideology. Now we see this same exact strategy with some slight modifications being used on the Muslim world. And if we allow this strategy to play out and be executed, then it's likely that the Muslim world will adopt and celebrate LGBT even faster than it was accepted in the West. So what are the components of this 6-point plan? Point number 1, talk about gays and homosexuality as much as possible, as loudly as possible. The goal is to desensitize. You want to make homosexuality something that is seen as completely normal, something that is completely mainstream. And you want the public to not be shocked by homosexual or transgender behavior. Ideally, they want Muslims to think about sexual preference in the way that you think about flavors of ice cream or favorite sports. I like chocolate, she likes ice cream. I like cricket, he likes football. I'm heterosexual, she's homosexual. This is the kind of normality that they're aiming for. Key to desensitization is to introduce gay and trans elements through cultural venues, TV, movies, music, books. And that way you're going to accelerate the desensitization and the normalization process. Point number 2, this is critical. You have to portray gays as victims, not as aggressive challengers. There is a huge non-bullying campaign. The point of these anti-bullying campaigns is to portray gays as victims who need protection and they need support. If they're successful in portraying homosexuals as victims, then that will create a natural reflex to want to protect that group. Ideally, the homosexual is portrayed as someone who's young, someone who is attractive, someone who looks normal by all accounts, but someone who is bullied, is a victim. In this way, the homosexual is transformed in the mind of a Muslim. In the mind of a Muslim, homosexuality is associated with Qawm Lut, and they were by no means victims. They were in fact the aggressor. But through an anti-bullying message, the homosexual is transformed into an innocent victim and indeed a symbol of innocence in need of protection. Point number 3, give the protectors a just cause. So anyone who's outside of the newly identified victims, the LGBT community, takes on this protector role. They need a just cause that they can rally behind. What is this just cause? You can make it about diversity, and this is something that Muslims already value because of Islam. So make LGBT a part of the diversity that Muslims can celebrate. You can also give Muslims the just cause of protecting rights. Protecting huquq is an important part of standing for justice within Islam. Muslims are not going to support the homosexual act itself. So that has to be decentered. What should be the center of concern is anti-discrimination. Are you going to discriminate and bully and unfairly condemn these poor innocent victims? That's the narrative that needs to be propagated throughout the Muslim world. By focusing on anti-discrimination, no longer is homosexuality about men penetrating each other's rectums in a kind of sexual fetish. That's not a cause that anyone would get behind. In fact, it's a cause that Muslims would be repulsed by and would reject. But if you change the conversation to be about anti-discrimination and something positive, like the fight for liberty, the fight for rights, then that becomes a positive message that Muslims might be more inclined to support. Point number 4 is really subtle. Emphasize that homosexual behavior is haram. Now, this might seem counterintuitive. If you focus on the haram aspect of this behavior, wouldn't that move Muslims away from LGBT acceptance? But there's this element of reverse psychology here, because if you emphasize the haram aspect, it makes you seem like you're a staunch defender of Islamic values. This then gives you space to promote anti-bullying or even all-out support of LGBT rights. The argument that can be made is that, yes, morally, LGBT behavior is haram, but we have to support the rights of this victimized, marginalized minority. This is a kind of Trojan horse that fools the Muslim community into thinking that LGBT behavior is haram, but supporting LGBT rights is perfectly halal and permissible and even praiseworthy in Islam, when in reality nothing could be further from the truth. Supporting LGBT rights is just as impermissible and haram and blameworthy as supporting the actual behaviors entailed by homosexuality and transgenderism. But this kind of bait and switch makes it easier for those who are more ignorant about Islamic values in this situation to accept LGBT normalization, LGBT rights, and so forth. Some of the more prominent Muslim preachers and academics in the West have been using this strategy for over 10 years, and what they've been able to achieve is getting the Muslim community in America especially to be more open to the idea that it is permissible for Muslims to support LGBT rights and to align with a LGBT political program. Now, those same preachers and their message is being exported throughout the Muslim world, and Muslim preachers in the East are learning from this strategy. They're very clear-cut and hard stance on homosexual behavior being haram in Islam, but we have to support LGBT rights. This idea is slowly starting to creep into mainstream Islamic Orthodox discourse. Point number 5, make the victimizer look bad. Make those who oppose LGBT as oppressors, who are old, they're out of touch, they're on the wrong side of history, they don't get it, they are intolerant, they are bigots. This is an important part of this victimized oppressor dynamic that is the framing of the entire LGBT proliferation movement that you want to create in the Muslim world. If this marketing campaign is successful, then the average Muslim will not want to associate with anyone who is anti-LGBT or in any way opposes that program. At first, this will create a culture of silence where the average Muslim doesn't want to risk speaking out and looking like a bigot or being accused of intolerance. Eventually, that culture of silence will allow the full LGBT program to get into full swing. Point number 6 is taking a step-by-step strategy for legal reform. In many Muslim countries, they have laws against homosexuality that have criminalized homosexual behavior. These laws used to exist in the West as well, punishing homosexual behavior and sodomy, but those laws were abolished, and step-by-step legal reform has taken place to completely transform the legal architecture within these Western countries. To replicate that in the Muslim world requires the same step-by-step process. We can understand this as خطوات الشيطان. When you have hudud, an actual capital punishment for homosexual behavior in certain Muslim countries, you're not going to be able to change that overnight. So you have to focus on less controversial issues. So the first step is to abolish hudud. What Western powers and NGOs already recognize is that some Muslims are already uncomfortable with the idea of hudud. They have, through years and decades of programming, been conditioned to see hudud in the Western lens as something that is barbaric. So they've been already primed as a public to be for the abolishing of hudud. That means that that step is almost complete in many parts of the Muslim world, and we hear every day of other countries that want to get rid of these kinds of punishments from the legal system. Once the hudud are abolished, then you can decriminalize homosexual behavior completely. That's the next step. And the US government and the EU has been pushing sanctions on any country that has criminalized homosexuality and homosexual behavior. So there is already pressure in this second step to completely decriminalize these things. The next step is to legalize their social spaces. So gay clubs, gay bars, these should be allowed legally to function and to not be closed down by governmental authorities. Fourth, create a protected legal status. This means a person who identifies as LGBT will get certain protections under the law that protects against any kind of harassment or any kind of perceived abuse or harm. One of the bigger steps is to legalize gay marriage. And this will require a lot of challenges in the legal system, but activists have been working hard to change the culture over all these years to normalize and to desensitize. And again, the argument that will be made is that yes, homosexual behavior is haram, but people should have the right to marry whoever they want, and to prevent them from marrying whoever they want is a type of discrimination. This kind of legal reasoning actually makes no sense, and if you want to understand why, I have some links in the description that explain how there's no such thing as anti-gay marriage discrimination, but they will really push this point in order to change the law in Muslim countries to actually legalize gay marriage, and Western countries will no doubt push very hard for these kinds of reforms. The sixth step is to actually introduce hate speech laws. Now you have to criminalize those who speak against LGBT. This has happened in many countries. It's actually something that hasn't happened in the US as of yet because of the First Amendment protections that flimsily protect certain kinds of critique. But in many countries like Canada, like the UK, like in South Africa, like even Australia, there are hate speech laws that can criminalize anyone who teaches against homosexuality or any aspect of LGBT. So by this point in the legal process, things have really changed massively. And now you get to the point where you make LGBT education part of the schooling curriculum, where children are now going to school at the ages of 4, 5, and 6, and it is mandatory for them to be introduced to LGBT ideology and the idea that love is love, there's no problem with a man and a man getting together, or a woman and a woman, or if you're a boy, you transition to a girl, or vice versa. This is now part of the curriculum. Once you have that change, then it's really easy to require things like gender-neutral bathrooms. Basically, you dissolve any conception of gender separation. You make sure that every space can include men and women. You also require people to change their language. If a person has preferred pronouns, you make it a legal requirement to respect that pronoun usage. Next step, you have to put more controls on parents and the parents' right to opt out of the LGBT curriculum in school. And also, if a child decides, because of his LGBT education in school to change his gender, then you criminalize the ability of the parent to take the child out of that. Preventing a child from hormone therapy and transitioning from one gender to the other is categorized as child abuse. Finally, you remove all other legal restrictions and you make it illegal to in any way discriminate against LGBT, whether it's in your employment practices, whether it's with how you teach within your religious schools or your masajid. You criminalize anything that opposes the LGBT ideology, and then the full legal transformation is complete. Following this 6-point plan, the Muslim world can be transformed in just 10 years or 20 years max. Have you noticed these steps being implemented in your country? Who are the main politicians, the main religious figures, the main actors and media personalities, the main academics that are pushing this? Knowing the plan is the first step in countering the plan. They plan and Allah plans, and Allah is the best of planners. Allahul Musta'an. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. If you want to study and understand this issue in greater depth and increase your faith in Islam with unapologetic answers to these kinds of doubts, then consider enrolling at Al-Asna Institute.